Okay, in Module 6, we are going to go ahead and start tackling child and adolescent sexuality. And so this is always something that people don't usually want to acknowledge, especially when they're parents. But obviously, there is increased sexuality, and that we are born with that capability. So, infant sexuality, to even call it sexuality, I guess, is misleading. But we do know that there are central nervous system arousal, especially around the genital areas. And that has to do with just our hardwiring of where the nerve endings end up. This is why you see little boys and girls, even toddlers, who will like to rub down there because that feels good. And so, children, I mean, yeah, children in general are very curious about kind of the reproduction and sex or sexuality. What makes a person biologically different? Why is one person called a boy versus another person called a girl? And so by age 6, about half of all children have engaged in some sort of sex play. And by sex play, it could be even like the photo there, where they just look at each other's genitals and kind of see what's different there, or playing doctor. We are not talking about abusive sort of situations by any means. And then about a 30% of children have masturbated. And once again, that's kind of the rubbing there, not associated with any sort of discharge or anything that you might see once you've gone through puberty. So, and then prior to puberty, what we see is about 66% of boys and 50% of girls have masturbated. So, by age 6, about half of the children engaging in sex play, about a third masturbating. By the time they're 10 or 11, you get those numbers going up to about 2/3 of boys and half of girls. So, there is a lot of curiosity and exploration going on. Now, it's very important to differentiate this type of sexuality and curiosity with sexual abuse. And sexual abuse can show signs for individuals for post-traumatic stress disorder, and a lot of different horrific issues in regards to overall developmental outcome, issues with attachment, and all sorts of things. So don't confuse these two, but we can't just overlook and say that children have no sort of curiosity in regards to sex. They are curious. And they think that by age 10, there's just real important landmark in that there is a time when boys and girls usually experience their first sexual attraction. So around 10, you begin to see that. And that's tied to the maturation of the adrenal glands. And if in my adolescence class, you see that the adrenal glands are something that contribute to the beginning of puberty. So you see this kind of pre-pubertal attraction to the opposite sex or sexual attraction. But then, of course, it goes into high gear once you see puberty occur. And so that launches us kind of into adolescence. And adolescence, sexual identity starts to be confirmed. Some know very early on what their sexual identity is. Others kind of experiment a little bit along the way to get a better idea of things. So what we have seen is over time, the double standard has declined. By the double standard, we mean that males are expected to go around, have multiple partners, gain sexual experience, and yet the girls are supposed to never have sex and remain virgins until marriage. And obviously, that doesn't quite line up for both to be true. One has to give or the other. And so we see our society kind of giving up some of that double standard. And so now what we see in adolescence is a little different kind of approach. First thing we see is this gender intensification. And so, where I think, if you remember in the last few modules when we talked about gender and gender identity, that you go from being very rigid in your gendered standards at 5, 6, 7 years old, and those become looser as you get older. But once you hit puberty, you get this intensification because now all of a sudden sex differences are magnified by the hormonal changes associated with puberty. And there's also this increased pressure to conform to gender roles because you're getting close to those adult roles that you've been seeing for so long. Another thing that happens in adolescence is that sexual identity or sexual orientation, and where you become aware of your preference for sexual partners of the same or other sex or both sexes. So Experimentation with homosexual activity is fairly common during adolescence, but few of those adolescents go on to maintain a permanent homosexual, bisexual, or transgender sexual orientation. The estimate's around 5 to 6% of the population that falls into that category of anything other than heterosexual orientation. Could be a little bit higher, especially now that there's a little more societal acceptance. People who maybe have had that identity all along maybe feel more comfortable expressing it. Some other ideas, and this is where the double standard has declined, that sex with affection is okay in a committed relationship. So rather than having to save yourself, our society is pretty much wink, wink, nudge, nudge says, yes, we acknowledge you're probably having sex prior to getting married, but that as long as it's in a committed relationship, that is still considered okay. That being said, there's still some confusion about sexual norms because we do give these very conflicting messages in our society. If you are in more Northern European areas, they're very open with sexuality and expect adolescents to have sex in a responsible way. And then you have other societies, like more Middle Eastern societies, where sex before marriage is considered absolutely forbidden, especially for females. And we're kind of in between, like you shouldn't, but we're not going to discourage it necessarily. We're going to show you all these images in our movies and stuff, glorifying it. It's just a very confusing. So the percentage of those who've had sexual intercourse in high school, and these numbers, of course, are dated, and they're always kind of going back and forth in regards to um, where they stand. And so, as you can see here, you do see some some ethnicity differences where you see higher levels of sexual intercourse among Black adolescents and the least amount among white adolescents, though we're not talking huge differences per se. And sexual intercourse is in this particular figure, not necessarily sexual behaviors other than intercourse. And if that was the case, you would see some different things. I think the reason that Blacks tend to have higher levels of sexual intercourse is that in their sexual scripts, intercourse occurs earlier in that script than it does for other ethnicities. And that in other ethnicities, there are other sorts of things that go on along the whole kissing and petting kind of priorities there. So that is a very brief overview of high school child and adolescent sexuality. And what we will go into our last module is to talk about adult gender and sexuality. So stay tuned for that one.